Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Jim Hall, and this is the latest in what I have found to be an enthralling series of events on the topic of building back better, lessons and opportunities from the COVID pandemic. And in this afternoon's conversation, we're literally going to be talking about building, about infrastructure, about the energy, transport, water, digital waste networks, and the built environment more broadly, upon which we all depend. And infrastructure is getting a great deal of focus in this context of post-COVID recovery. In fact, after disasters, infrastructure is often looked upon. We might think about the New Deal, which led to the creation of the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam, post-war reconstruction across Europe and Japan and many parts of the world. But this pandemic has been different because nothing has actually been destroyed. On the contrary, public acceptance, in particular public transport systems, has really been transformed. And yet many of the people who we've had in these conversations in the Oxford Martin School have spoken about a green recovery, about how our recovery should be focused on the huge goal of achieving net zero. And meanwhile, there's the government's agenda of levelling up, of dealing with geographical and social inequalities. And this evening, to discuss these topics, we have Sir John Armitt. It would be hard to think of someone more qualified to talk about this. Sir John is chair of the National Infrastructure Commission. He's been absolutely central to infrastructure in this country for many years, as a contractor with Lang and Costain, and then in senior client roles as chief executive or chair at Union Railways, Network Rail, and a celebrated role in the Olympic Delivery Authority. He's also been on the board of Transport for London, part of the Airports Commission, and was chair of the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. So welcome, Sir John. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our audience. For those of you who haven't been in these events before, let me remind you first that the event is being recorded, and it will be available later for you to look at again or pass on to people who may have missed the event. And you can ask questions by putting them in the Q&A box, and you can actually vote on questions as well, and those votes will push the questions to the top of the list in front of me. But before we get to questions, Sir John, over to you. A lot is being expected of infrastructure, not least from our Prime Minister, who has a penchant for the grand projet. But can infrastructure actually deliver on COVID, net zero, and levelling up?
Well, thank you, Jim, and good evening, everyone. Yeah, I mean, clearly these are the three hot topics. COVID and recovering, the economy recovering from COVID and the role of infrastructure, I think is probably, in a sense, the bigger challenge, or expecting too much is the bigger challenge. The point about infrastructure is that it takes time to plan. It takes time to from concept to the point where you go for planning consent. That can then take 2 or 3 years. And so you've got a 5-year front end probably for any significant project. And of course, as we've seen with some projects, a 20-year front end before actually the shovels go in the ground. So when government has been saying to us in the last 6 months, well, what would we recommend we get on with, which is shovel ready? It's not an easy question to answer, but the answer we have given is, well, actually, one of the things which you can get on more quickly with is, for example, the rollout of the infrastructure required for electric vehicles. That's relatively relatively low skill in many respects, because it's a lot of it's about digging trenches, and the cheaper part of that is actually putting in the cable and the connection. The expensive part is the civil engineering front end. In a similar way to that, of course, the rollout, which is already underway, of full fibre, accelerating that is as much as possible, is another way of doing something which can be got on with quickly. And I never cease from saying to government, don't forget current expenditure. And if you were to say to the public what irks them most about our infrastructure, potholes would be fairly close to the top of the list, and therefore releasing money. As we recommended back in 2018, we recommended to government 500 million a year for the next 5 years be pushed towards local authorities to help them get on with with road maintenance activities. So those are the sort of things which you can get on with immediately post-COVID. We've also been asked, of course, to do work on what are the behavioural changes arising out of COVID, and we're expected to do that work in the next sort of 6 to 9 months. Arguably, that's too quick, that's too fast. Will we actually have any really clear picture of what the world is post-COVID? And Jim mentioned the whole issue of the attitude towards public transport. I'm chairman of National Express, and we have our own views as to at what pace we think people are going to come back to using public transport, but it's very difficult to judge just what pace there will be a pickup of public transport. And government has been very successful at telling us all not to get on public transport, and of course they've now got to reverse that message, and that will be interesting to see how successful that is. On zero carbon is clearly a very big part of, and I think what's driving infrastructure investment, actually, interestingly at the moment, is the whole zero carbon agenda. It's a sort of virtuous circle in that sense. But the big challenge is in hydrogen and is in energy and the sources of energy. Nuclear is clearly still there on the agenda, but no agreement whatsoever between government and the private sector yet as to how it's going to be paid for and how the risks are going to be allocated. Heat is probably one of the biggest challenges of all. How are we going to address the heat question? Is it hydrogen? And how long is it going to take us to get to the point where we know how we can produce hydrogen at any sort of economic rate? And how do we then distribute it safely? Or are we going to go down the heat pump route? Heat pumps sound seductive, but they're not much use unless the home that they're being applied to is efficient. The bulk of our housing stock is not efficient, so heat pumps are not necessarily an immediate and easy answer to heat. And of course, improving the general efficiency of our housing stock has proved one of the most difficult things politically to achieve in recent years. There have been many failed starts, and at the moment, again, the government's allocated some money to that over the coming years, but getting public acceptance of people coming in and trampling all over your home in order to make it more efficient is not particularly attractive to the public, and they're not going to be willing to borrow lots of money to do it. So that whole programme and how you take that programme forward with either public housing or private housing is a real challenge. Back to electric vehicles, I think that is something which is interesting. The government's made a very clear policy objective there to not allow the sale of petrol and diesel after 2030. That will only be practically deliverable as a policy if, in fact, the infrastructure is there to charge these vehicles and people are willing to buy them. So again, there's a need for delivery as opposed to policy, and there's a tension inevitably there between how much government has to inject some support into that and how much they can rely on the private sector to do it. The whole issue of natural capital, of course, is part of that zero carbon agenda, and the use of natural capital for our infrastructure rather than grey grey capital is another debate. On levelling up, I fear there's a risk that this is a very obvious and politically popular slogan, but there will be a limit to the public patience as to how long they can wait to see any real action in that field. We believe it requires more devolution of decision making and devolution of finance to enable those decisions to be fulfilled at a local level. And that is something where there is, I think, still quite a major question mark over that, and the degree to which government is willing, if you like, to sort of release the reins and to be more trusting of city mayors and combined authorities in allocating resources. The tendency still at the moment tends to be that they have to bid for the financial resources necessary to level up using infrastructure as part of that. So I think there's quite a long way to go on that whole devolution debate. And infrastructure by itself isn't going to deliver levelling up. There are other factors, particularly skills and training, which are going to need to be addressed in a significant way. So there's a few introductory thoughts anyway.
Thanks very much indeed for that, John, and a number of points I'd like to come back on. First of all, in relation to the demand side shock with respect to public transport, and you were on the Airports Commission. Do you think we're going to see a third runway at Heathrow? And for HS2, a lot of the argument there was around, or the justification was around capacity. On what sort of timescales do you see that demand ramping back up?
Yeah, I think they're both very fascinating questions. I mean, as you say, when I was on the Airport Commission, we were looking at a continuous growth. I mean, Heathrow itself runs at something like 98% capacity, and it doesn't need very much to go wrong at Heathrow before the wheels come off. And you could see a continued potential growth, particularly with the expansion of international markets, requiring an improvement in the facilities at Heathrow. Of course, the big challenge at Heathrow is that investment largely does come from the private sector. And so, that is going to be a group of pension funds and private sector owners of Heathrow making the decision as to when they feel is the right time to make that, to take that bet on investing sort of circa 15 to 20 billion pounds as being the right time. Personally, I would say it is still a good bet to make in the long term, and that but of course this won't get finished until 2030, even if they press the button tomorrow. So that sort of judgment, which has to be made in a commercial sense against seeing what's happening. I mean, if I were them, I suspect they're not going to make a decision in the next 12 months. They'll wait for 12 to 18 months before they can see what's happening on the global market in terms of the travelling expectation. I mean, I personally continue to believe in cities. I continue to believe in people's desire to actually travel. I mean, I read something this morning about virtual holidays and the fact that that's picked up as a market in the last year. But I mean, at the end of the day, a virtual holiday is not going to give you the opportunity to go on your sightseeing trip and then go to the local restaurants and do all the other things that we do when we go on holiday to get the full experience. So and with the growth of the economies in Asia, particularly, and the expectation of people in the Asian economies to be able to travel the world and use their increased income and spend it in that discretionary way, I would expect to continue. So in that sort of medium to long term, I would think those markets are still going to come back. Now, when it comes to rail in the UK, people are saying, well, probably there might be a diminution in the number of executive journeys being made. that creates an interesting revenue stream challenge, because like the aeroplanes, more of the revenue comes from the sort of first class ticket or the front end of the aeroplane, which subsidises the back end of the aeroplane. So if you see a drop off in executive travel, that's going to have an impact on fares overall. But I don't see, maybe a 20% drop in executive travel, perhaps, where people will say, well, do we really need to go on the train to go for that meeting face to face, or can we do it over Zoom? Yes, we've all got used to Zoom. We can see the advantages and the disadvantages of Zoom. Every board I'm on, everybody can't wait for the moment when they actually get back to a proper board meeting as opposed to a Zoom board meeting. But there will be choices which have now been created as a consequence of COVID. So yes, there must be a risk of some drop off. How many people will work from home and not go back to the office? Totally contradictory views being bandied around about that at the moment between different companies and what they think is going to happen. I read the other day somebody who has been doing this since September. And interestingly, they said the worst thing is not having control of your staff and them choosing whether they come in Tuesday, Thursday or Friday. And that if they are going to have a more working from home approach, then it needs to be much more directed and controlled by the company to say, right, okay, almost a bit like we had dress down Friday in the old days, it's now going to be, work from home Friday, because having the whole mixture of some people in the office, some people out of the office doesn't necessarily work very well when it comes to meetings. And there's some other research being done which shows that, in fact, people who are not in the office are less likely to be recognised, less likely to come up for promotion. You need to be seen to be heard, as it were, and that could be another factor. So a lot of uncertainties, but I'd be surprised if in the long term we weren't back at somewhere between 80 and 90% of current use.
Just still briefly on the recovery, you mentioned the sorts of smaller scale things which can be have much shorter lead times, the potholes, the broadband, the home insulation, the EV charging, fixing leaks in the water distribution network, I would add to that. But do you see any evidence of that actually happening? I mean, if we're going to stimulate the economy, it needs to be happening now, doesn't it?
Yes, and of course this gets you into that very increasing triumvirate, I suppose, between government, the regulator, and the utility sector. And there's a continued focus, of course, by the regulators and by government on lowest charge to the consumer. Lowest charge to the consumer then can act as a constraint on some of the rate of investment or the nature of the investment. I mean, there's a negotiation still to be had, for example, and finalised between the government and people like Openreach and Virgin in terms of how is the last 20% of fibre rollout going to be paid for, and what's going to be the balance between private sector investment or government support for that last 20%, the harder to reach places. I mean, they'll compete with one another enormously to be the ones to put the fibre down the high street in the centre of town. They're not going to compete violently to be the one who takes it out to the small industrial estate in the country with 5 users on the end of the cable, which is going to cost £100,000 to get the cable there. So there is that tension which is going to need to be addressed to get that full rollout, and so for addressing that tension sooner rather than later is what's needed if you're going to get that extra resource directed to particularly fibre. The EV infrastructure, I think, is a more complex question around what is going to be the nature of EV charging. To what extent can people rely on slow charge? To what extent do you actually need really rapid charge points? That actually plays back into the motor vehicle itself, because some of the cheaper motor vehicles won't be able to take a super fast charge anyway. So you've got, again, a real need for collaboration and discussion, which I would argue requires more government leadership more willingness by government to get on the front foot and be seen to be more demanding, and if necessary, initially taking some risk before it can step back and say, right, we've got the ball rolling, now we can leave it to the private sector to continue. Road maintenance is pretty straightforward, you know. I mean, it's just a case of money, shoveling the money out the door, quite frankly. But that comes back to the whole devolution. I mean, what do you see at the moment with road maintenance? Is it all happens in February and March because people sort of rush to get through their budgets at the end of the financial year to make sure that it's spent because they can't roll it over into the following year.
Let's move on to net zero, and you referred to, in many respects, the, let's say, the very positive direction of travel, and one might even say success story in terms of electricity, the more or less total removal of coal-fired generation from the grid in this country. What was it, 2 months last summer without any coal at all on the grid for the first time since the 1880s. But as the analysis from the NIC demonstrated, I mean, a lot of this is down to plummeting costs of offshore wind, which has been a fantastic example of how competition fuels innovation and gets prices down. But the NIC's analysis showed that it does get more tricky as you get more and more wind onto the grid. And you were questioning the extent to which new nuclear would be necessary and whether one can make do with hydrogen or other forms of storage. And where do you think we should go on that? It's becoming more tricky now, isn't it? That question with respect to the grid.
Yeah, I don't think it's changed. We actually published a report only this week on system operation. And of course, interestingly, the regulator is seeking to separate the system operator out from National Grid and and is recognizing the importance of the system operator in all this. And the point we make in our report this week is we still believe that, in fact, for the consumer in 2050 and maybe 2040, the electricity need be no more expensive because you have got a very large reliance on renewables. But what it will require is more investment in the distribution network and the systems, using sort of digital resources and the use of data. So smarter and smarter systems in order to cope with the variances which are coming on due to renewables. But we haven't moved away in our latest analysis from the fact that we think that you can have a highly renewable provision of electricity, and that you, at the moment, we would still say, yes, get on if you like and order one more nuclear power station, but still a question mark over whether you'll need anything more beyond Hinkley and, say, a Sizewell. And of course, at the current rate at which that, I mean, if you worry about brownouts and say, well, we've got to have that sort of traditional baseload facility with nuclear, then again, things are moving too slowly. They haven't got a financial basis and a commercial basis for going ahead with another nuclear power station at the moment. And EDF clearly not going to make their costs and their program is overrunning at Hinkley, not surprisingly. And if you look at the history of nuclear power, that's been the case for the last 25, 30 years. So I think potentially you might finish up coming back to, well, do you have green hydrogen combined cycle power stations as being your base, your backup base load, in the way that we've had gas-fired power stations as a quick turn on, turn off backup in the past. So might we be looking at that in the future rather than nuclear? That then brings you back to at what pace are we developing our understanding of the best way to produce hydrogen?
Yeah. And then on the the demand side, you mentioned heat and buildings and the behavioural, the resistance, and the sheer logistical difficulty of doing what needs to be done at scale in people's homes. I mean, any thoughts on what needs to be done to actually crack that?
Well, as we suggested in the first place, move on the large-scale housing association-owned public housing side, because that's where you can get repetition. The big challenge with the private sector is how does anybody walk down the high street as a provider and persuade sort of 60% of the homes in that particular street, in Acacia Grove, let's call it, that they should actually spend more money on making their homes more efficient. People move home on average every 7 years or so. So their willingness to invest in what essentially is maybe a lost investment, unless it's going to make it easier to sell at the end of the day. It didn't work at all under the green incentive of a few years ago. And I think there is still a major challenge in public trust as to how you get the public to feel that they are being sold something where they can trust the supplier or the installer or the energy company at the end of the day, that this is going to be in their benefit. I mean, the smart metering has not helped. That's not been a successful rollout so far. And in the same way as you don't have compulsion on smart meters in the water sector, so that continues to be a bit of a hit and miss. I mean, I think perhaps, my own view is at the end of the day, the compulsion around metering and smart metering, it will become necessary. How do you get, companies, every company I'm involved in, or every organization, I'm sure Oxford University, everybody's drawing up their green strategies and saying, we're going to be carbon zero by 2040, 2050, and we're not going to use so much energy in our buildings and so on. That again is easy to say, much more difficult to do, will require behavioral change, will require incentives. The easiest thing is to look at new buildings. But in 2050, probably buildings which we haven't built today will not form more than 20% at the most of the stock of buildings which are around in 2050, whether they're commercial buildings, hospitals, or private homes. So we've still got, how do we retrofit and how do we deal with the 80% of buildings who are going to be as they are today and are going to have to be retrofitted in some way, or there's going to have to be a behavioural change by us as occupiers in the way that we use those buildings if we're going to actually reduce demand, as opposed to only focusing on how do we change our supply mechanisms.
Yeah, well, you're right. There's a great deal of thinking going on about that in Oxford University, which, as you will recognise, as an organisation with a diverse building stock, let's say. Levelling up. Actually, I suppose a surprising, possibly a disproportionate amount of the discussion around levelling up is in relation to infrastructure, transport for the north, for example. How much do you think infrastructure can actually do with, how important is it for levelling up?
Well, there's a discussion going on at the moment as to whether or not we might do a piece of work on that and try and understand that better, and in what ways can infrastructure be most effectively used to do that. It's easy to imagine at the extremes, isn't it? That, well, if there's a city sitting there which doesn't have a rail connection, doesn't have decent road connections, then investors aren't going to make their way there. On the other hand, if you're talking about marginal improvements, to what extent does that help? And of course, we get into the much wider debate now anyway about, well, to what extent is infrastructure improving the quality of life rather than just improving the economic cost-benefit analysis approach. And when we did our analysis of rail investment in the north, for example, recently for the government, and finished up recommending more investment at the cities which are close together, rather than cities which are a long way apart. That was partly a debate around the use of the rail network, not just for getting to and from work, but for access to social activity, social amenity, as well as just, well, are there going to be more commuters going between A and B? But interestingly, when you look at that, if you look at the Northeast or the Northwest, 70% of people who get on a train are making that journey locally. They are not making that journey to London. And in fact, some analysis shows only 10% of journeys are made between the Northeast, Northwest and down to London. The majority of journeys are actually made between cities in those regions, and therefore the argument which we propounded to government was that in the short term, medium term, you were better off in making those infrastructure improvements to benefit those northern and Midland cities. There are other factors which are equally important, and skills is certainly one of them, and that's a whole extra debate as to whether or not in this country at the moment we are effective in creating skills bridges, for example, from one set of skills to another, which are needed tomorrow, which aren't needed any longer today, and how we do that. Whether young people coming out of school have sufficient encouragement to go into further education as opposed to advanced education, which frankly I don't think is working at the moment to the degree that it should. But that starts back in schools. It doesn't start at 18. You've actually got to be getting people into that mentality when they're 10 and 12, not when they're 16 and 18, and it's too late. So I think skills is a massive debate, and I have a personal view, which is that in fact government gets too involved almost in this, and industry needs to actually be far more engaged in this in the way that they are in Germany, where you get a much more collaborative approach between local government, between industry and between the educators as to how best to get the balance between those who've got a university education and those who've got a technical and a vocational education. But it's a big challenge for investors and people wanting to start up new businesses.
We've got a number of questions coming up now, which I'll come to in a moment. But looking at the shopping list we've just talked about, the next question, looking at the also the state of the public finances, is how much of this is affordable? How should we prioritize?
Well, I think the interesting thing there, of course, is that so much of this is private sector investment. Public sector investment in infrastructure is only in three and a half ways. I would suggest there's road and rail, which is the bulk of it. So at the moment, it's sort of circa somewhere between 23-25 billion a year goes into public expenditure into infrastructure. Most of that is road and rail. A small amount goes into flood management and flood control. There is obviously that which goes to support private sector programs such as digital, potentially EVs and so on. The government has in fact, I think, announced a total of about 2.3 billion in one way or another, either in supporting battery manufacture and research or in supporting the rollout of the infrastructure. But 2.3 billion over the next 5 years is 2% of the total budget of government spend on infrastructure. But the much bigger investment is being made by the private sector, whether it's in energy, which is massive, as big at least as transport investment, telecoms, and water, all of which are in private sector hands. So their ability to invest is driven by the regulatory regime and the settlements which are reached, and what's the working cost of capital, and all these sort of erudite arguments which go on within that sphere. But government does have a role to play, and we've argued this in terms of better regulation. We have argued that in fact government should be more directive and broader in its direction to the regulator because the regulator essentially responds to government direction. So there is an opportunity for government to influence that. But in terms of public expenditure, at the moment it's 1.2% of GDP is what the government roughly says to us is the fiscal remit. Now that could potentially be increased by a couple of points going forward. I think what's interesting is that we seem to be in a bit of a Keynesian moment at the moment, not just in the UK but around the world in responding to COVID, particularly the need to get economies going again. And so we're seeing more government, not less government. And you can see in the programs, whether in Europe or in America or in the UK, the temptation for government to, at the moment, take the brakes off and to be willing to put more financial stimulus into economies, and part of that will be through infrastructure. But of course, inevitably, there will be those who say, well, that's all very well, but sooner or later it's going to have to be paid for, so how are you going to get the money back? But in the next 12 months, one can see there's probably more pressure on releasing money rather than clawing it back.
Do you think the government and indeed the privatised utilities are getting value for money from the construction sector? It doesn't have a great reputation for productivity. The Olympics were delivered on time under your leadership, but Crossrail is not such a great story. And perhaps this links to your point around skills as well. Do we have a sufficiently skilled up construction sector?
No, we probably don't. But I would argue that my argument, having been a contractor and having been a client and sort of everything in between, what happens in an industry is driven by a client. And the degree to which the client is demanding of its supply chain, the degree to which a client is demanding of the quality, the degree to which the client sets the standards that it expects to achieve, is what potentially is going to drive innovation and is going to drive price competition more than anything else. So I would say the people who can drive a better supply chain from the construction industry at the end of the day, whether it's in the quality of the product or the materials which are being used. I mean, I was in a debate a couple of days ago where we were talking about this, and I said, well, if you want less embedded carbon in your buildings, you're not going to get that simply because somebody sits there thinking, oh, it might be a good idea if I came up with a product which was less embedded carbon. You're more likely to get it if more clients are saying to the designers and the designers to the contractors and the material suppliers, I require this standard in future. I require this level of embedded carbon to be, reduced from X to Y over the next 5 years. Now, how do we work together in a collaborative way between client, designer, supplier, contractor to actually achieve those improved efficiencies and those improved quality of materials and less carbon in the materials which are being used? Just sitting back and hoping it's going to happen, it won't happen. There have to be real incentives and real challenges. I mean, as a client, I'm far more interested in offering more return to my supply chain in order to get my work under budget and on time than I am in writing endless contracts which set out all the penalties that I'm going to apply to them if they fail. Because their intellect will then go into making sure that they don't pay those penalties and dreaming up all sorts of reasons why it's my fault, not their fault, that the project's late or overrun on the programme. So I'd much rather be sitting down with them and saying, right, what do we need to do next to make sure that we still come in under the budget that I can afford and we still come in on the time that I require. And that's what we did at the Olympics. And I think there needs to be a lot more of that approach within the industry to get the improvements that are required, rather than the confrontational approach that the UK particularly, more so than any other country almost, has had for the last 200 years.
That reference to materials, low carbon materials, now speaks to a couple of the questions we've got here from both Harriet Mogridge and Stephanie Burrell. And we know that steel and cement as some of the tough nuts to crack in terms of decarbonising. I mean, how much of that do you think can be done with savings on materials, substitution, or to what extent are we just going to have to rely on carbon capture and storage at steel works and cement works?
Well, I think they're interesting questions. I mean, in recent years, I think the Chinese have put up something like a 40-story building in timber frame, demonstrating that timber as a structural material can be used on a building of that sort of scale. On the other hand, here, as a consequence of Grenfell and fire regulations or fire standards going forward, we've almost probably got into sharp reverse gear when it comes to using timber as a material in buildings. So if you want to actually use timber as an alternative to steel and concrete, then we've got to really get our heads around how we do that in a way which removes that fear of fire in buildings and makes buildings safe. And you get into a very tricky debate then about, well, what's more important, the building or the person? And should we actually worry about the building burning down at the end of the day, or should we worry about the means of escape and egress and the way in which, if that ultimate problem does arise, and in fact more people have died as a consequence of fires in homes than they have in high-rise buildings. So, you know, there are a lot of tricky issues around that area of substitution. Steel, of course, do you produce it from a steelworks which relies on coal to fire the furnaces, or do you use electric arc, and do you use recycled materials? Now, recycled materials at the moment cost more to produce a ton of steel than it does if you use coal, and you've got that debate going on at the moment about whether or not we should have a new coal mine in this country under the sea in order to fire up our steel mills in Stockport and elsewhere. I mean, these are real, you know, at the end of the day, these are almost binary choices which somebody has to make as to which way they want to go. Do you want to, you know, say, well, we'll have another coal mine because then we don't have to import it from somewhere else and all the costs of importing and the carbon which is generated by that? Well, okay, no, we don't want to do that. But if you don't want to do that, then you've got to be prepared to pay more for your steel. And so you could argue there's a public debate. There's often, I think, in all of these areas, a public debate to be had, which isn't had, as to public understanding of what the choices are, public understanding of do I want to spend a bit more, do I want to be charged a bit more in order to have if you like, salve my green conscience, that in fact we are having the right effect on our climate change challenges. I mean, when we were doing the Olympics, we were in discussion again with the cement manufacturers about how they could reduce the carbon, if you like, the carbon output of their works in producing their cement. And that came back to, well, what are alternative fuels which could be used in that regard? And again, I think you have to set these challenges and demonstrate. If you get large-scale setting of challenges where large-scale clients acting together are actually willing to set these challenges, then you'll get the technological innovation which is required to come up with some of these solutions.
Now, there's a question here about water, which we haven't talked about a great deal. The NIC did a study on the resilience of water supplies. And the question here is around the national water grid. But perhaps you could just summarize for us what you think needs to be done in terms of the resilience of water supplies.
Well, at the moment there are two options kicking around. And what's interesting is since our report is that there has been an increase, I think, in cooperation between water companies in terms of working together, combining their resources, sort of accepting the risk across 2 or 3 water companies rather than across just one, to say, well, you know, if we need to make this significant investment, for example, in a new reservoir, or if we need to look at how we can efficiently move water between us and support one another in terms of when we've got peaks and peaks of demand and how best we can we devise cost-efficient pumping systems which move water between one water catchment area and another. I mean, there is more happening, is what I would say, and I think it's encouraging to see that the water companies are working together more today than they were 5 years ago. But that's what's required. I mean, to have a whole national water grid, I think is still questionable in terms of can that be done in an efficient way, and what will be the cost of, water is very heavy. Moving water and pumping water around the country is not going to be cheap, and one would hope that, comes again back to, well, can we reduce demand as opposed to just thinking we've got to meet supply and increase supply all the time, and how can we get ourselves from using 130 litres per person a day in our homes, but down to sort of 80 litres a day. I mean, that sort of, on the Olympics again, we reduced the flow of water in the showers by 30% just by putting a valve in, which made sure that the athletes got 30% less water than they might have thought they got. Because behaviourally, people don't actually notice that much difference. And you can actually get people used to using a lot less water than they might normally think they need. So we have to put as much focus, I think, on how do we address and how can we address the demand side. Our production of paper, of course, is one of the massive, it's staggering when you see how much water gets used in the production of paper. So again, there are those technological challenges within the manufacturing sector which need to be addressed as much as in the domestic use. But I think it's an area where, I think it's what I'm seeing is encouraging. Whether it's fast enough is another question, but at least I think it is starting to move.
And just to answer the sub question on Daniel's question is, well, what about the carbon footprint of pumping water around the country?
Yeah,
well, of course, that depends on where your electricity comes from, and where a good way to decarbonising the power network and the attraction of, in a sense, of water transfers is you can, to some extent, pump when the renewable electricity is available. You can modify your demand side.
Yeah, you've also got the cost of putting the network in, of course, and if that's going to be in plastic pipes or whatever, then what's the carbon footprint of the pipes that's going to be used, or can you actually make those movements, as has been suggested, for example, between the Severn and the Thames? And can you actually move it between one watercourse and the next? Then you find that next minute you've got a biodiversity debate going on as to what extent can you mix the water from this watercourse with that watercourse. Now you're going to affect the biodiversity of the system which is receiving water from somewhere where there's a different sort of geological makeup and so on, and so the water is of a different type. And what impact does that have on the nature aspects and if you like the fauna and the flora and everything else of the receiving network. So these are complicated issues, and for every bright idea, there's somebody who will turn around and say, well, that might be a bright idea, but what about this consequence and what about that consequence?
Now, there are a couple of questions around electric vehicle charging, both from, I suppose, the point of view that maybe in a town like Oxford with crowded streets, we just struggle to see how exactly that's going to work. And there's a coordination problem here. Is this best done in a devolved way, or to what extent does there need to be national leadership and indeed national standards to sort out some of these really tricky, very local issues?
No, I was in a conversation before this one, actually, two conversations ago today, where we were talking about standards. Not only the standards of the product, but also the standards, and should there be almost a license, a skills license in terms of the people installing these systems and what, and so on. I mean, this was by somebody who's actually got a Tesla, and so he was talking about his experience of having that vehicle and the charging. I mean, yes, I think local planning has a lot to do with this. Local planning consent, local planning demand again. So, no, Mr. Waitrose, you can't have a new supermarket and a car park unless you're going to pay for the installation of 20% of the car parking spaces, or maybe even 40% of the car parking spaces, providing a charging opportunity for EVs. To what extent local authorities are willing, I mean, many local authorities in London now, the boroughs are actually, you see more and more lampposts with charge points in them in London at the moment. So I think local government has a big role to play in the provision of charge points. When I talk to the people on the charging side of this, it's quite interesting because they will point out that not all cars are capable of taking super fast charge. The cheaper cars don't have the battery technology in them to actually take a charge in 15 minutes and be fully charged. They actually rely more on a slower charging mechanism. Easy to deal with in terms of new housing, but again, it requires legislation to say that every new home will have a charge point if it's got a garage attached to that home in future. But an enormous number of people, of course, have vehicles where they're not parked in the garage, they're parked on the street. I'm one for a start. I've not yet solved that conundrum as to what I might do if I had an electric rather than the petrol car. I switch from diesel to petrol. The next change is clearly going to be from petrol to electric, and how do I deal with that? So I think it seems crazy not to have a single standard. But then we've not succeeded in that with our mobile phones, have we? And it's even worse with a mobile phone, because even if you buy it from the same supplier, each time you buy one, the charge cable from the old one doesn't fit the new one. So you're caught for another 20 quid for a new cable. So whether or not legislation and the introduction of standards will potentially, I think, would be a good thing in that regard. But then it's not just, it's not local. I mean, you could argue that's international, because when you take your electric car across Europe, you presumably want to see a single charging type of opportunity, single type of cable connection, whether you're in Italy or whether you're in Germany or whether you're in Poland. It's so there are some big international questions around that. But at the end of the day, people are going to be reluctant to buy these vehicles unless they can see that these sort of opportunities for charging their vehicles without hassle are available. I mean, I listened to somebody on the radio the other day who said that she'd driven from the UK to Poland and back, and it had only cost her £19 in electricity for her car, using the app, which told her where all the charge points still are at the moment, where there is no charge. So at the moment, you have got energy companies making energy available for your EV at no charge. Now, the energy companies themselves say we're only doing this as an introduction. Once we've got you hooked, then we'll obviously start charging you. But again, we're going to be looking for competition, of course, in terms of that charge. But electric vehicles are going to be, setting aside whether the petrol cost and the electricity cost become the same at the end of the day. It's going to be a very complex world, I think, or a very simple world. So, will the manufacture of cars only take place where there is a battery factory next door? Or are we going to be shipping batteries halfway around the world as we do at the moment? Or do we actually need to make sure that this is a single facility which makes the battery is going to be the most important part of the car. It's where the value will be. The shell will become cheaper and cheaper. In a sense, do you even own the vehicle in the future, or do you just simply rent the vehicle, because what you're really doing is renting the battery? And so does the whole concept of vehicle ownership change as we change to electric vehicles? The garages will go out of business to a certain extent because there'll be no maintenance, or a very limited maintenance compared with what there is today on a conventional internal combustion vehicle with gearboxes and complicated engines. The electric car is much, much simpler, much fewer things to go wrong, fewer things to change. So it changes the whole dynamic of ownership potentially. So, but fascinating area. And I suppose at the end of the day, one can't help but believe that this will be like the mobile phone technology. All of a sudden, there will be a tipping point at which this will just become the norm.
Now, John, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to, before we finish, ask you about the National Infrastructure Commission itself. And you were instrumental in making the case for the NIC to come into existence. It's been around for what, about 5 years now?
5 years now.
You've had a first national infrastructure assessment, a belated government national infrastructure strategy. You argued for it with a view to taking a longer term perspective, depoliticizing as far as is possible infrastructure decision making. To what extent do you think the National Infrastructure Commission has achieved those goals you originally had, and what more really needs to be done?
Yeah, I think again, had this conversation this morning, where I said that I thought what was interesting about the depoliticization, because the model that we have is not the model I suggested. And the model I suggested actually was one where there was more cross-party debate within Parliament, leading to national policy statements, and therefore getting that greater sort of cross-party cohesion. The model we have doesn't do that. I mean, the decisions are made by the government of the day. Having said that, whenever I talk to opposition spokesmen in infrastructure, there really isn't that much argument about the sense of direction. It's more about how does the money, maybe how's the money made available, or to what extent does government get involved. But in terms of what we should be doing, there isn't a great debate. And I think that's partly because another debate is overtaken. And the other debate which is overtaken, of course, is the zero carbon debate. So I think what we've now got is where there is cross-party support and cross-party recognition and public support, is that at the end of the day, zero carbon climate change has created a level of agreement which is enabling the infrastructure to then become the enabler itself of achieving that zero carbon. So then it's back to, well, what are the technologies and what are the choices of technologies, and how do we actually get ourselves into that zero carbon space, which I think has enabled some of what might have been potentially arguments in the past to come away from the infrastructure debates themselves. I think the bigger infrastructure debate will continue to be around resilience and how do you actually ensure that you get that investment for the future, which lays a cost on today's taxpayer or today's consumer. And so that whole regulatory debate, and how do we, to my mind, it does require an even greater opening up of the debate and the discussion with the public, and a more honest debate with the public about, well, are we going to sort of try and get along simply by focusing on the lowest charge for the next 3 years? Or are we willing to talk about what the cost of some of these choices are for the next 30 years, not just for the next 3 years? But I think we're in a reasonably, I feel we've got off to a reasonable start, and I think the concept of a National Infrastructure Commission seems to be reasonably well accepted and established. Might be my famous last words, but overall, I think government and politicians recognise that there is some benefit, particularly in having somebody else other than themselves who is prepared to ask or put forward some sort of challenging solutions, which they don't necessarily want to put forward themselves. But the role of the NIC, in effect, is to be the daft laddie in the room, if you like, who asks the question that nobody else wants to ask, or poses the solution that other people don't really want to grapple with because they don't like the consequences. And I think there's a role for us in being that sort of spur for new ideas and for pushing for new solutions.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming to talk in the Oxford Martin School this evening. It's been a incredibly wide-ranging conversation, which has taken us from some of the biggest challenges which we face as a society and indeed as a planet, down to some really pretty techie local details. So very impressive. Thank you very much indeed for that. Just one final reminder to our audience that the next talk in our series is Professor Sadie Crease, who will be talking about emerging technologies and systemic risks. So I hope that you'll be able to join us for that. And thank you again to Sir John, to our audience, and I wish you all a very good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience for coming.